Buddy, my name is Seth Ressler. I'm from Michigan Podcast Productions. So glad that you could be here. This is the official launch party for Untold Detroit Beer. It's the brand new podcast that's coming out from the Detroit Historical Society. We've been working on it for several months, and we are really thrilled to finally be able to share it with you. In just a couple of moments, I'm going to bring up our speakers. Before we do, I want to let you know that the podcast is now available. You can find it in Apple Podcasts or in Spotify. Go listen to it. Go subscribe. Tell all your friends. Also, there is an exhibit that goes with the podcast. You can see it now at the Detroit Historical Museum. It is the Detroit's Brewing Heritage exhibit, and I want to give a special thanks to the folks over at Founders Brewing, who are the presenting sponsor for that. Before I bring our speakers up, I do want to share with you just a little taste of the podcast, let you hear a little bit so that you can get a preview of what's going on.
Stroh's got caught in a cycle of borrowing money to grow, but eventually it was not making enough money to pay down its debt. To offset costs, Stroh's was forced to shutter its flagship brewery in Detroit in 1985.
I remember, we bought Schlitz. We had that 7-plant network around the country. The Detroit plant was hemmed in by freeways, had no rail. I mean, there were a lot of disadvantages. There were higher labor costs in Detroit. Ultimately, that plant was the one that was less optimally located, really couldn't have its efficiencies improved without, unaffordable capital investment. We closed it quite painfully, and you might remember seeing pictures of angry Detroiters dumping Stroh's beer out, vowing to never drink it. And we used to think, my God, if they'd been drinking it in the first place, we wouldn't have closed the plant.
That was the voice of John Stroh, one of the heirs to the Stroh brewing empire, one of the many voices that you will hear on these 6 episodes of this podcast series. I want to bring to the stage first the man who's going to be our MC for the evening. He is the owner and operator of Motor City Brew Tours. He's also the author of the book Detroit Beer, A History of Brewing in the Motor City, and he's the host of the Beer Tour Guy podcast. Steve Johnson. Welcome. Good to have you here. Turn your camera on. Hey, how you doing?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, glad to have you here. And of course, the other person we want to bring to the stage is the host of the podcast. You heard his voice just a moment ago. He is an assistant curator at the Detroit Historical Museum and the host of the new podcast, Untold Detroit Beer, Billy Wall-Winkel. Come on up here. Welcome to the show. You're muted. Go ahead and unmute your mic. There we go.
Hello there.
And with that, Steve, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Well, thanks for having me, and welcome everybody today. Welcome to our Industry Insider Night, and thanks for joining us on this great day here. And a little bit more to kick off the Society's first podcast, Untold Detroit Beer. I feel like I'm supposed to pause in that, Billy, as I say that, right? Why don't you tell me a little more about why the Society decided to do a podcast?
We were all working remotely at the time. We've been talking about doing a podcast for a while now. And what the pandemic did was it gave us an optimal time to try it out. We knew it was going to be a heavy lift. We didn't really understand how much of a heavy lift it was going to be, but we were all really excited. A lot of us love listening to podcasts. Everyone on the podcast team could easily rattle off their top 6. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that we were living up to the Society's mission, which is to tell Detroit stories and why they matter, and to tell it in as many formats as we could. And so podcasting was one of them. And we, once we were able to pick beer as our subject, especially because we had the exhibit coming up, we were really excited about the opportunity we had.
And I guess, how did you do all the interviews as we've been in this COVID bubble that we're all living in?
We did them all over Zoom. We were able to take advantage of people's cell phones with the mics that way. I did them in my living room with the air conditioning unit off because the air conditioner was too loud. And I took the cushions off my couch and surrounded myself with couch cushions. And we did them that way. We had to improvise a little bit, but we made sure we got the best quality we could.
Well, I'm glad you chose Detroit beer because it's a great topic and it's one I know a little bit about. So let's get into a little bit of the history. Let's kind of start with how did brewing in Detroit start and who was responsible and maybe discuss a little bit on the Native Americans that were there kind of during that time.
So brewing goes back almost as long as the city does. When the city was founded in 1703, they didn't have beer right away because everything that came to Detroit, everything they brought with them to Detroit needed to last the journey. And beer, like today, doesn't last that long, especially if it's in a canoe, right?
Right.
So after Detroit is established, beer comes to Detroit with Joseph Parent in 1706. He got invited by Cadillac to come to the city, and Parent was a jack of all trades. He was known as a mechanic, and he was also the city's brewmaster. He came to the city under an agreement with Cadillac that he got to make all the beer he wanted, but Cadillac also got his cut free of charge. So he started making beer. Before that, they were drinking most likely other fermented beverages like ciders and brandies because they had plenty of orchards to get the materials from. We know that the Anishinaabe people in the region had an understanding of fermentation. It wasn't the same as beer, but it wasn't something that was brand new. So in 1706, when Parent came to town, they started making beer, and they started making small batches. It was most likely small beers, so like 4.5%. They weren't making a whole lot of it because it was something that was harder to make. You couldn't make large batches of it, right? So it also wasn't something that was traded then because you could only have so much of it. It was largely kept within the community, so it wasn't traded to native tribes, say like harder liquors were, which the government didn't want traded to the tribes anyways, but that was still done for nefarious reasons and non-nefarious reasons. But it started then. The tradition of brewing in Detroit started with the small batches that the French settlers were making and only grew from there.
So then let's talk a little more about kind of what came after that. So there was kind of that Indian French influence, and then we kind of had our next wave of immigrants. So this is typically when I would talk about this on a beer history tour. I'd say the English, Irish, Scottish kind of came into the picture. And let's discuss a little bit about them, or mainly the English.
Yeah, so I joked that the first major shift in beer in Detroit got ushered in with a bang. So following the French and Indian War, the British took over the territory and the French had to leave. So when the English settlers came to town, they had a strong ale tradition, porters and stouts, which supplanted what the French were doing. It was a different type of beer. It was a hardier beer. There's a few sources who describe it as akin to a loaf of bread in consistency.
Yeah, bready what you say a lot of times.
Yeah, it was thick, but it's the type of beer that they were drinking back home, and it's the colder weather. It's hardier. It's stuff like that. So that was the tradition for roughly the next 100 years almost. Until you start getting you get the German migration in the 1830s, but then you get the German takeover really in the 1860s. So for 100 years or so, Detroit was an ale city. Ales dominated. It was small batches still. It was larger than the French, but nothing by today's standards. And you knew your brewer, right? The shelf life of beer didn't get that much longer in this time period. So it would be small batches. A brewer would make it, take it in a wheelbarrow, take it over to a tavern, and sell it. It wasn't until the 1820s and 1830s that we start getting established breweries, and we start getting more and more taps, right? There still aren't a lot of taps. It's not like walking into Hopcat and you have your pick of 100. But you start getting more varieties in, but it's still more varieties of ale. It's just different people making it.
Kind of a different one on every corner, basically.
Yep. It was like a Starbucks. And there was that many because one person couldn't make enough.
Yeah, there's some stats that say there was like 40 active breweries in kind of that mid 80s to late 80s, 1880s kind of time frame, 1800s, excuse me.
Yep. In the 1840s, it starts growing, and then 1850s, it's just ballooning as the city grows, because this is when the city is doubling in population every decade. So starting in the 1820s, the city doubles in population. Going to 1830s, it doubles again. 40s, it doubles again. And the numbers of breweries grows to match the city's population, because this is during the time that you didn't really trust water too much. We didn't really know how waterborne pathogens worked, except for it most likely came from water. So people were really afraid of cholera. There was a really bad cholera epidemic in the 1830s that really cemented for a lot of people the need to drink beer. Beer was low in alcohol content, so you could drink it throughout the day without getting trashed. Unlike drinking straight whiskey, what some people did was they took a shot of hard liquor and dumped it in their water to clean it. But beer was it wasn't more readily available, but people found it a lot tastier than doing the other.
Now, we just had Fat Tuesday. So speaking of other kind of immigrant groups, right? Let's talk maybe a little bit about the Polish. And then we also had Belgians that were here.
Yeah. So the Polish came to town roughly the same time as the Germans. It's the Polish community, historically speaking, is sometimes hard to track, because what is now Poland was Prussia, was Germany, was Austria, was Russia. So that community is sometimes mixed up. But yeah, they came to town with their own styles, which largely got supplanted over time by like the German domination. But they had Zydnas, and the Polish population in Hamtramck had Auto City, and they were really, really staunch community breweries. For the Belgians who settled on the east side, they had Tivoli, and that was a Belgian brand, and they were in your face about being Belgian because they were proud of what they were making.
Yeah, they were on the lower east side.
Yep.
They got very large at a certain point.
Yep, and the Belgian brewing tradition goes back hundreds of years, and so when like the Flemish community started coming to the Lower East Side, they made sure they brought that with them.
Well, that's pretty awesome. That's a good intro into this. That folks, as they listen to all 6 episodes of the podcast, are gonna get a lot more details on. They're gonna really love it. We're going to, since Seth just popped in there, that's probably my cue, right? We're going to take kind of a quick history break and go into some of the breakout rooms for maybe about 15 minutes. And to kind of get this conversation going, let's think about something unique about early Detroit brewing history. So what's one thing that you think is unique about early Detroit brewing history? And we'll talk about that in the breakout rooms for about 15 minutes.
And we're going to go back to networking, let you guys chit chat for a little while. We do want to let you know that there is a Q&A tab while these guys are up here. So if you have questions in the next segment, we'll take some audience questions as well. We've got one already. And if anybody else has any questions, feel free to just pop them in there. But mingle amongst yourselves, talk, and we will bring these guys back up in just a little bit. Thanks, guys.